we can talk about climate zones. We can look at a variety of different maps that break it into a variety of different climates and subclimates. So if I move myself up here really fast, right, we can see here are some versions of a tropical climate, a dry climate, a moderate climate, a continental climate, a polar climate, and areas where there's non-permanent ice. We're not going to need to get nearly this specific in the way that we look at climate zones. So we might look at a map like this, right? That there are polar climates in the northern and southern portions of the Earth, that we get temperate and continental in those next regions. We get dry and tropical, right, in that variation of slightly above and slightly below the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. But again, excuse me, this is again a little bit more in depth than we're going to get. Here's the same kind of thing, right? We can look at wavering lines and get a specific different or very, very hyper specific climates. Again, we're not going to get this exact. So you should have something like this in your notes, right? Here's our crude map of the world that we are going to sketch into 4 different climate zones. So if we want to think about the northern and southern portions of the globe, those are going to be our polar climates, and we'll define these a little bit more in depth over the next couple of slides. Just above and below the polar climates are going to be what we call temperate. Right above and below the temperate regions are going to be what we call arid or dry climates. And then here we've got this chunk between the tropics and the equator that we're going to call tropical climate. So here is your quick breakdown of what each of these climates are. So tropical climates, for the most part, are found near the equator, right between that 23 degrees north and 23 degrees south latitude, that tend to have warmer temperatures throughout the year because they are consistently getting the same amount of sunlight from that direct, angle hitting them throughout the year, where regardless of which way Earth is kind of tilted at that 23 degrees on its axis as it's rotating. These tend to be, pretty humid climates, which means you can feel the water content in the air, and you tend to see things like a lot of lush rainforests in this area with high degrees of rainfall, right? Because as it's constantly getting hit with the sun, you're going to get a lot of rain because the water cycle is happening at a more accelerated pace than areas where sunlight is happening in a little bit more of an indirect method. Arid climates tend to be these areas that are fairly dry. They cover about 14% of the earth, and they're getting very little precipitation because there's not a lot of surface water in these areas. So it tends to stay dry because it's more difficult for the water cycle to go through its natural ebbs and flows. These arid climates tend to be between about 15 and 30 degrees latitude on both sides of the equator, which can have some very wild temperatures and might make it fairly inhospitable to life, meaning it's harder for things to live there. Temperatures can also wildly vary, where it is very, very hot during the daylight hours and very, very cold at nighttime hours. Excuse me. One of the reasons why these areas are arid or it becomes difficult to chart the amount of rain that can happen is because this is where global wind patterns may make it difficult to determine how much rain happens, because things like a global jet stream may not directly impact these areas. So this could, make you think of places like hot deserts like the Sahara in northern Africa, or some colder deserts like the Gobi Desert, which is found in both Mongolia and China. Temperate climates tend to be these mid-latitude areas. So these are areas that can get a little bit of everything in the 4 different seasons that we experience. So Here in Kansas, we definitely are in a temperate area because we get, very warm summers, very cool winters, but then we can also have things where, like, hey, it might snow in March, or hey, it might be 85 degrees in November, depending on the given year. We tend to have moderate levels of rainfall, so we're getting consistent precipitation throughout the year, enough to maybe replenish the amount of groundwater or surface water that is lost through evaporation. And uh, the inland regions may have a more distinct kind of continental climate. So we'll look at these a little bit more when we are speaking about specific areas, or we're in specific units where we're talking about areas of the globe with more temperate climates. Next, we've got the polar climate. These are our ones at the top and the bottom of the globe. They're the North and the South poles. They tend to be very cold, where the temperatures drop below zero. And it's because there are long periods where the atmosphere is not getting, direct contact from the sun. Again, think of these areas that as the sun is pointing at the earth, they're getting the last bit of rays that hit the area depending on the direction the earth is tilted. These areas tend to stay fairly cold and covered in ice and snow. And if there is, enough precipitation that is happening, you are seeing potentially some of the snow pack on the top of mountains melt, kind of sink into the groundwater. And then as the air gets heavier and heavier and heavier, it may, right, again, replenish itself with more snow. So, the last thing that this kind of brings us to is talking about biomes. And this is a long video, far longer than I wanted it to be. So maybe I cut it into two parts. I'm sorry. But biomes are large areas of the planet that have distinctive ecosystems. So, if we are thinking about some of those maps where we are seeing very distinct subregions acknowledged in terms of their climate, those allow us to kind of identify specific biomes. These biomes can also be differentiated based on their specific environmental and physical features. So the types of water that exist, are there mountains, plateaus, plains, forests, what kinds of things are impacting or helping kind of naturally regulate part of the weather patterns there that compose the climate of the biomes. So we're going to talk about these biomes, especially when we look at the impact that biological life can have on the natural environment around them, from talking about plants and animals, talking about the range of temperatures, plant life, soil quality, all kinds of things. So you may be familiar with these from earlier grades when you talked about geography, but this is when we're talking about things like a savanna versus a tundra versus a grassland or a forest. So we'll think and talk about all of these things a little bit more down the road. And again, I'll see you shortly. I'm probably going to cut this video in half because it's about 20 minutes long and nobody wants to listen to 20 minutes straight of me. So, see you next time, y'all.